Good morning. Welcome to the Eastman Financial Report. I'm Dan Eastman, your host, and today is February 17th, 2026. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, we appreciate your viewership here at the Eastman Financial Report and throughout the day on all of the fine programming you see at Worldview Tube and, of course, here at Worldview Radio. We broadcast live Monday through Friday from 11:30 to 12 Central Time from the great metropolis of the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, using the mighty Cobalt microphone. And here we are. It matches our background. It's wonderful. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. And we do really appreciate your viewership. And as you know, this is a Christian broadcasting system and it's a Christian broadcasting network. And it's our ministry, our mission, our passion, and our goal to bring to the great marketplace of ideas the news and information of the day from a Christian perspective. And if you'd like to help us in that ministry, we would be delighted to have you join us. And you can do that by going to worldviewfoundation.com and making a donation. There's an address on the bottom of the screen. You can go to wvwfoundation.com or worldviewfoundation.com. Or you can use the handy QR code on the screen, and that will take you to the website, and you can sign up for a one-time donation, which we really appreciate, or you can sign up for a monthly donation, which has the added economic benefit of helping us match our revenue to our expenses, and then keeping our bottom line positive. And that's what keeps us able to bring our content to you free of charge every day. We don't charge a paywall or a subscription. We broadcast globally from a Christian perspective because we have sustainability, and that's why your donations really matter. So if you'd like to help us in this ministry and you'd like to keep us on the air broadcasting free of charge, please do that. Please go to worldviewfoundation.com or www.foundation.com and make a donation. You can also help us in this ministry by doing business with the companies you see advertising throughout the day. Unlike the big guys, we don't sell blocks of advertising time. Rather, we partner with companies that we know and trust, and the goods and services that they offer throughout the day are wonderful products to be had. And of course, when you purchase from them, a small portion of the proceeds comes back to us in the form of a commission, and that also enhances our revenue line and keeps us positive. So by doing business with these vendors, you're not only helping yourself with great products, but you're also helping the network as well, because we certainly are a beneficiary of that as well. There's a third way you can help the ministry, and of course that is by looking at our product called worldviewtube.com/vault. If you type that into your browser, worldviewtube.com/vault, right here on the bottom of the screen, that will take you to our Vault product. It's a newer product, and of course there is a little paywall here, and that's the point. When you subscribe to the Vault, you are getting access to amazing Christian content, and it's very spiritually uplifting. As you know, Brandon House has been in this ministry for his entire life, and he's been broadcasting since 2006. He's written 15 books. He's had seminars, events, conferences, and all of that information is now digitized, and it lives in the Vault. So when you're looking for some spiritual uplifting and you're looking to watch and understand and read content developed by and for a beautiful Christian body of believers, that's the Vault. And sometimes if you're having a little rough spot in life, or you'd like to think about, we always turn to Scripture, of course. But in addition to Scripture, if you'd like to be part of the bigger church community, the Vault subscription is great, because there are times, like all of us, we have better days than others, and sometimes you just want to log in. All of the content is on demand, so you can see some really great stuff. If you're up at 2 o'clock in the morning and you can't sleep like me, you will have access to some great content. And that also helps us in this ministry by subscribing. And keep in mind, we all know people in our lives who are struggling, either spiritually or with life issues, relationship issues, financial issues. This is a wonderful gift. You think, what can I give or help? How can I help my friend? How can I help my friend who is struggling? Giving a gift subscription to that friend so they too can log in 24 hours a day on demand and see that there is uplifting scriptural material within the vault that's very helpful. So it's something to think about. So subscribe for yourself, and then also think about a friend, relative, somebody in your life who could use a little spiritual uplifting, and make sure you give them that wonderful gift as well. Well, that's how you help us out. You can make a donation, and you can do business with the companies you see advertising. And of course, you can subscribe to the vault, and you can do all three. It's a wonderful thing. I will point out that within the vault, we keep many treasures. And one of those treasures, of course, is the reruns from the Eastman Financial Report. So if you'd like to critique my work or call me out or challenge my thinking, that's wonderful. Please subscribe to the vault, pay the money, have at it, and then come on the show. We'd love to have you here. We can debate the dismal science, and I'm sure we can put many people to sleep debating the nuanced architecture of modern economic thought. But the point is, it's a treasure as well. Well, let's talk about the news today. There's a lot to talk about, and I did want to talk about the power data center issues that I was talking about yesterday when I ran out of time, but we're going to circle back to that today. But first and foremost, the U.S. core inflation rate, the consumer price index, or CPI index number is out. And lo and behold, it's at a 4-year low right now, where the headline number dropped from 2.7% inflation to 2.4% inflation. And that's how it's calculated by the federal government, which is very interesting because, as we know, the Federal Reserve has a dual mandate from Congress to regulate the economy through a monetary policy. We don't have central planning like the Soviets had back in the day, which turned out to be such an economic disaster. Rather, we have this idea that by fiddling around with the money and fiddling around with the interest rates, you can stimulate the economy or slow it down. And that's what the Federal Reserve does as part of its legislative mandate. Now, we all know this thing was created back in 1913 after a secret meeting on Jekyll Island. And the Federal Reserve went live in 1914. This has been a long time. And lo and behold, their job is to do a number of things. And I might as well just review this now. It'll be on the quiz, of course. But the first and foremost, the most important thing that the Federal Reserve was designed to do was to be the lender of last resort. Because before the Federal Reserve was created, the United States, after its creation in 1789, when our Constitution was ratified and the United States of America became a thing, or at least a nation, there has been a strong debate and a very populist attitude against having a central bank. And the reason that the colonial Americans had such a jauntist view of the central bank was because they looked at the Bank of England in London, and of course they saw how that organization funded not only Great Britain, but also funded a global empire of colonies. You can keep in mind this idea that the Britain and Spain, of course, and France, and even the Dutch and some of the other colonial powers, even the Germans had a little toe on the earth in Africa. But the point is, the idea was that you would grab a piece of land elsewhere and you would capture the economy of that piece of land. Now, of course, the land wasn't empty or barren. It happened to have lots of native people living on it. So you'd show up, plant your flag, announce that you are now a colony of Great Britain or France or Spain or wherever. And all the local people who really hadn't any idea how this colonial thing worked because they're busy living their lives elsewhere, suddenly found themselves being British or English or French or Spanish. And lo and behold, overnight they became something else. And that's the colonial magic. And all of that was funded by the Bank of England and the Bank of the Treasury in Spain and the French, they all had their own central banks. And the idea was that you could create money out of nothing and go out and buy stuff. And that's what happened back in the 1600s and the 1700s, this idea that you can grab other parts of the world and create colonies, which was not always a bad thing, because what the colonial powers did was they brought roads and buildings and infrastructure and a legal system, very important from the British perspective, that one of the great colonial legacies of America is the Anglo-American legal system that we still use and respect today. And all of that came as a package. Well, the point is, when the American colonists finally pushed the king back, King George III was, he was never here, but he was sent, his regime was sent packing back to England. There was always this jauntist view of central banks, because people understood the power of these entities to create money. And then you take money and you go out and buy stuff like India and Canada and all these other places you could buy with money, Massachusetts, Virginia. So the point is that there was a jauntist view of central banking. And when the American experiment, as George Washington said, became a thing in 1789, the idea was that we would be local, live local, think local, act local. We weren't thinking global back in those days. As a matter of fact, we wanted nothing to do with the rest of the globe. We were happy to have created our own little seaboard sliver of a new experiment, the great experiment, as George Washington and his fellow patriots would talk about. Can this work? Can people actually govern themselves without a king? And will this work? Well, the point is the central banks had no place, and banking became very democratized, and small towns would have small banks, very much on the model of the Italian model from the 1400s and 1500s, and those small banks became the core of the American banking experience. But they were locally owned. A couple of shareholders, families used to own banks. Some guy would just set up, open a storefront and hang a sign that said bank in the window, and people would come in and deposit their money with an expectation of getting their money back. There weren't regulators back in those days. Nobody was regulating the banks. You could just have one, you see. You would open one up and you too could have your own bank. Well, the problem is, as you can imagine, without regulation, and as a dyed-in-the-wool conservative here, regulation has always been something of a hot potato, because you realize that without a regulated financial market, it quickly becomes the Wild West, and then it becomes just an absolute free-for-all. Regulation is good. If you can regulate a banking system or a financial system so that it's fair and objective and open and transparent, then the free market can operate. If it's all pockets of collusion and centrifuge, then free markets don't operate. And what happens is wealth transfer from the naive to the not so naive. And that's the whole purpose of regulation. But that didn't exist back in the day in the beginnings of the United States. So as we had the economic expansion, the Monroe Doctrine was falling into place, and we were going from sea to shining sea, one thing was noticed quickly, that there wasn't enough money in the system to build all of the major cities and all the infrastructure and all the railroads and all this and that. And the banking system was still based upon this idea that you'd have a local bank, and they were state chartered banks. For the most part, banks were state chartered. Well, there were two attempts at a Federal Reserve Bank or Federal Central Bank, and both of them were shot down. As a matter of fact, Andrew Jackson, the founder of the Democratic Party, who's still spinning in his grave over what that party's become, he was a rather conservative populist, unlike the Democrats of today, which are not. The point is, they were very happy to kill off both of these attempts at a central bank. So during America's expansionary period in the 1800s, bank failures happened all the time. People would put their money into the bank, and then the bank would lend it out to farmers and merchants and manufacturers. And of course, one farm or bank, something would fail. The bank didn't have enough money to pay the depositors. The depositors all panicked and showed up on the same day demanding their money back, and the bank would fail because it didn't have the money. So if you watched Jimmy Stewart, It's a Wonderful Life, your money isn't in the bank, it's over at Joe's house and Bill's house. Well, that's exactly how it worked, because there wasn't any network. So if your local bank failed and you were the pigeon with the deposit, rather than the person who borrowed the money and failed to pay it back, then the banks would fail, and it was not good for the economy. And we had a number of serious panics in the United States in 1837. And no, I wasn't around in 1837, but I remember reading about it and ancestors talking about it, that it was quite a panic, because the banking system had lent so much money to so many people with this expansion into the Northwest Territories and then beyond the Gateway and through St. Louis after Lewis and Clark figured it all out. There just wasn't enough money. And that panic lasted a couple of years, and it created a problem where nobody had any money and nobody could pay for things. Supply chains cratered. It was a mess. So the point is, when the Federal Reserve came along finally after the panic of 1907, which was another big bank panic that was bailed out individually by none other than J.P. Morgan himself, using his own personal funds to basically bail out the American economy, it became clear to not only poor J.P., who was never destined to become America's central bank, that we needed one. And that's why the powers that be, looking from New York, which was primarily where the money center was, and that was because so much trade came into New York and so much trade went out of New York, that's where the biggest pile of money was. And at the time, nobody wanted New York to become the central bank. Big banks in New York were a thing unto themselves, and they financed a lot of the American expansion, the steel and coal and the petroleum, all of the industries that we grew up with were effectively funded by New York. And the problem is, it was a rickety system. The farther west you got, the ricketier the banks were, the more likely it was, if you were a farmer, if you had any money to put on deposit, you'd probably never see it again. So by 1913, it was needed to have a federal bank. And the big purpose was the lender of last resort. If you had a federal bank, a national bank, then if a local bank was failing, the federal national bank could shovel the money in the back door and Jimmy Stewart could hand it out over the front counter and save the day. And then they'd clean up the mess later. And that was the real driver for a Federal Reserve. And that's why we have 12 banks within the Federal Reserve System. There are 12 regions across the country, and each region has a Federal Reserve Bank. And those banks are owned by local banks. They're not owned by the government. They're owned by local banks. And the board of directors and the president are elected by the shareholders, which are the local banks. So the local bankers elect the Federal Reserve Bank, and then the 12 of them are the Federal Reserve System. And that whole system is governed by a board of 7 governors who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the United States Senate, and they serve 14-year terms. So it's a long term. And that's what Jerome Powell is. He happens to be the chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Well, the whole idea was to stabilize the banking system. And of course, that took a little while to figure out. After it was created, 1914, World War I broke out, and we had infinite amounts of money to finance World War I, and we did. So by the time World War I ended in 1918, the money machines were running and the roaring 20s happened. And of course, they all collapsed on October 29th of 1929 because there was way too much money in the system, like today. And then we went into the Great Depression, which was very much, from my opinion, an illusion created to basically suppress. Anyway, I need to take a break. I'll be right back and I'll finish the story. Be right back. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Would you like to gain access to over 20 years of my radio shows, TV shows, my books? I've written 15 books, and most of those books are ebooks now. And we have conference DVDs, conferences where we filmed our conferences at the Ozarks, literally starting 20 years ago. It's all available in our archived vault. All you have to do is go to worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and for a reasonable monthly fee, you gain access to over 20 years of Christian worldview programming, news, information, books, documentaries, and a powerful search engine. And folks, it's a great way not only to educate yourself, equip yourself, but it's a big way that you can help fund our continuation as a broadcast network. Please check it out. worldviewtube.com/vault, worldviewtube.com/vault, and help us continue pushing out a Christian worldview.
Okay, so we talked about how the Federal Reserve came to be, and their purpose was to shovel money into these failing banks to keep them from failing so that the depositors could get some money back. They get the equivalent of what they deposited. They get their money back, and the banking system calms down, and we don't have a nightmare. And that's why it took from 1914, and then throughout the 30s, there were bank holidays as the Federal Reserve was tweaking this model and system. And of course, they had experience financing World War I from 1914 to 1918. They funded the 1920s, the Roaring 20s. They tried to figure out how to stabilize during the Great Depression. I'll talk about that at length someday. I think the more I'm convinced with media as propaganda, the more you begin to realize in retrospect the illusion of the Great Depression needs exploration. I think it's time. We're coming up on 100 years later, and what we know today, we may have to rewrite that story, make it a little more truthful. The point is, the Federal Reserve's job at that point was to stabilize the banking system. Well, then the idea came about that you could use this money machine to actually manipulate the economy. And this is coming right out of John Maynard Keynes' head. This is the Keynesian theories of the 1930s, which supplanted the classical economic theories of the 1700s, Adam Smith's supply and demand. In the long run, Adam Smith said economies will come into equilibrium. And John Maynard Keynes, clever British guy that he was, said, in the long run, we're all dead. What can we do in the short run to make life better? And that was the beginning of monetary policy and the $38.5 trillion in national debt and the $2.5 trillion in annual deficit, because the Keynesian theory is based upon this idea that you don't just tax and spend, you can tax and borrow and spend. Debt is good. And that's why we're in the situation we're in. But the point is, when this became a thing in the 1930s, because Roosevelt and his brain trust and all these smart people were trying to figure out how to save the world, it's real easy. Start World War II. That'll do it. And it did. So by 1945, we're on a trajectory where we want to not repeat the alleged depression of the 1930s, because aggregate demand would collapse and there would be all sorts of interruptions within the economy as service people were coming back from the Pacific theater and the European theater, millions of Americans. What are we going to do with all these people? Well, that's when monetary policy became a real thing. And emerging from the 40s into the 50s and 60s, it became this idea that the Federal Reserve would be able to control the economy like an accordion player at a Wisconsin wedding playing polkas. They're basically doing this to keep the economy at just the right size. Not too big, not too small. It's kind of be in the middle. And they do that, of course, by adjusting the position of the punch bowl at the banquet table at the reception. You push it a little closer to the edge, people have some punch, the party fires up. Maybe you pull the punch bowl back, things calm down a little. Well, that was the metaphor used for the Federal Reserve. But what it was doing was exercising its monetary authority given to it by Congress. And the way they do that is, in theory, it's not a punch bowl moving it forward or back. It's setting the interest rates. Interest rates are higher. That means it costs more to borrow money. Companies don't borrow as much. The economy cools down. Back in those days, citizens didn't really borrow a lot of money. Nobody would lend money to a mere citizen. But the point is, you want to stimulate the economy. You cut the interest rates. Money's cheap and businesses are expanding and the economy's growing. So it really became this idea of expanding and contracting the interest rates to stimulate the economy. Well, why don't we just cut the interest rates to zero, or have the banks, basically you have to pay money to put money in a bank. You cut the interest rates to zero like the Japanese, and you should stimulate your way to the heavens. But the problem with that is that as more and more money is entering the system and the interest rates are low and the economy heats up, we see this economic phenomenon that exists with fiat currency called inflation. That the buying power of the dollar is deteriorating. And it's not something that somebody thought of in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. We look back to the same phenomenon in the 1920s in Germany, the Weimar Republic, and the way it had printed money to the point where it was a hyperinflation situation and the money became worthless. You can look back to the Roman Empire when they started fiddling around with their silver coins and diluting the silver content. That was 2,000 years ago. You can look to Argentina recently until they had a new government that's brought economic stability. You can look at Zimbabwe, the same thing. You can even look at Venezuela up until recently, that when you create money out of thin air and everybody has more money, they will spend more money and prices go up for the same goods and services, and that's inflation. So how does the federal Congress, the federal government deal with this phenomenon? First of all, you bail the banks out, keep the banking system safe, and that's a good thing. We want the banking system to be very stable, and it is. If you looked at 2007, 2008, that was a real close call, and the Federal Reserve, FDIC, and even the Treasury stepped in and saved the day. So we didn't have banks collapsing. We didn't have people standing outside, pounding on the glass, screaming for their money. We didn't see any of that because we saved the system. Now it cost $9 trillion in quantitative easing to do it, pumping $9 trillion new dollars into banks and pulling junk bonds or junk e-bonds off of the balance sheet, substituting with crisp new dollar bills, and lo and behold, stabilizing the economy. So how do you balance that? If the Federal Reserve's mandate is stimulate the economy, let's grow the economy, you need a counterbalance, and the counterbalance is the dual mandate. Number one, you want to keep full employment, which means keep interest rates low enough so the economy grows and we have unemployment of 5% or less. That's full employment. And secondly, you have to keep inflation under control, because if it's too much, then that's the hidden tax. That's where people without fixed assets that will have a tendency to rise in a market are going to be burned big time. So you have this dual mandate. Not only do you keep the banks from collapsing, but keep employment full, because the politicians like that, especially during election year. You don't want a bunch of unemployed people running around because they vote for the other guy. And then, of course, keep inflation under control. And that has been a very difficult deal to achieve. It's very difficult. You cut the rates to stimulate. The minute you stimulate, the inflation goes up. So the Federal Reserve set this bogey and said, okay, we're going to do 2% inflation is okay. We got a little bit of inflation. It's kind of like the spice of the chili. It kind of helps the flavor a little bit. But more than 2%, that's a problem. Well, when we look back since 2007, 2008, and the quantitative easing, and they put $9 trillion new dollars into the economy, I peeled it back a little. And then what we realize is the inflation numbers keep coming out, and they are higher than 2%. And the only way to get inflation back to 2% is to put the brakes on the economy by raising the interest rates and effectively cratering the economy, which means massive unemployment in a midterm election year. It's not happening. And that's basically what happens, is that the people of the country are the ping pong ball. You're back and forth. Going to have inflation destroying your wealth, or you're going to be unemployed. Which would you prefer, ladies and gentlemen? But these are your only two choices, sort of a Hobson's choice. Well, now we see the core CPI number coming out. And of course, it's a 4-year low, which is great. And it is down to 2.4% from 2.7% on an annualized basis. But the Federal Reserve, and now with a new chairman coming in, effectively is starting to blip out information that suggests that maybe 2% isn't the right number. Maybe we should have 2.5% to 3.5% inflation. If we could get by with 2.5% to 3.5% inflation and keep interest rates low to stimulate the economy, that'll produce inflation. So let's move the goalpost, okay? Effectively, if we want to score the touchdown, we bring the goalpost a little closer to us so we don't have to kick the ball quite as far. That's effectively what's happening. And many commentators have been talking about this. I've been talking. If you subscribe to the Vault and you go into the Eastman Financial Report reruns and you go back, I'm coming up on my 3rd year of broadcasting. It's what a wonderful blessing. I don't get paid to do this. My personal ministry. I love it. But it's 3 years of archived data in the Vault. So you subscribe to the Vault, pay the fee, and then go back to what I was saying 3 years ago, and you'll begin to see that I was talking about inflation is inevitable. And while the Fed has a 2% bogey, it's too late. You can't ever go back without a massive destruction of the economy at a time when Americans are pinched. The take-home pay isn't enough. The costs are going up. That's why when you see 2.4% inflation, you have to say that with a smile. I mean, everywhere you go, prices are going up by a lot more than 2.4%. But these are the government's numbers, right? So they must be right. But the point is, we are looking at an adjustment upward where the new normal is going to be 3.5%, because it's reflecting reality. And that's all driven by the $38.5 trillion in federal debt. There's no way to unspend the money. It's there. There's no way to pay off $38.5 trillion. It's soon to be 40, soon to be 41. As a matter of fact, they kicked the debt ceiling up to $41 trillion. That was back in December. The problem is there's no way to true that up. So you have to live in an environment where you're running massive deficits every year, 2.2 to $2.5 trillion in deficit, annual 12-month deficit, adding to the stack. And Congress can't even get its spending under control to give us 1 year off. It's like, remember, in Scripture it talks about every 7 years you forgive, then every 50 years is a jubilee, and everybody's debts are forgiven, and you start over. You rebalance society. Well, that's not happening. It's not happening because every one of those bonds and notes are on somebody's balance sheet. It's an asset. You're not going to be canceling federal debt because you'll be canceling somebody's assets, and that's not happening. So the only way out is to make $38.5 trillion look less important than it is. And how do you do that? You inflate the general cost of the economy until $38.5 trillion doesn't look so big, which is a lot of inflation. So that's why I think we were all very much correct. And the interesting thing is when you look at the 10-year Treasury, it's down to 4.04% from 4.2. It's effectively showing that they are bringing the interest rates down, and in order to do that, you're going to have to yield on the inflation number, and that's why we're seeing these signals. And 2.5 to 3.5 looks pretty good. Anyway, I'm out of time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Go to worldviewfoundation.com and please support our ministry and make a donation. And thank you for listening. And I promise tomorrow I will talk about data centers and power. I didn't quite get there today. Anyway, have a great afternoon. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.